Night fell, bringing with it a biting cold and the oppressive silence of the forest. The elderly woman, exhausted and with scratched skin, felt despair grow. It was then that from the shadows an almost mystical vision emerged. An albino tiger with sapphire eyes that seemed to penetrate the darkness. There was no aggression in its demeanor, only an ancestral curiosity. The giant feline approached slowly, and the elderly woman, paralyzed by fear and exhaustion, awaited her end. But the tiger did not attack. Instead, it lay down a few feet from her, its imposing body forming a barrier against the icy wind. The warmth emanating from its thick fur was an unexpected relief, and its eyes, fixed on the darkness of the forest, seemed to watch, protecting the fragile woman from any danger that might approach. The beast, whom her son had expected to be her executioner, had become nature's silent guardian, a living shield against human cruelty. Dawn broke, not with the gentle touch of a new day, but with the relentless chill that precedes the sun. The first rays of light, pale and hesitant, peeked through the dense canopy of trees, painting the forest floor with irregular patches of grey and blue. The elderly woman, still caught on the barbed wire fence, felt her body stiff from the icy night, every muscle protesting in agony. Her scratched skin and deep cuts on her legs burned with renewed intensity, a cruel reminder of her imprisonment. The albino tiger, her improbable guardian, remained. Its sapphire eyes, which in the darkness of night had seemed like mystical beacons, now reflected the faint light of dawn with an almost human depth. It did not move, made no sound. It merely watched, its massive and silent presence a surreal counterpoint to the woman's fragility. The warmth emanating from its body, once a welcome relief, now seemed only an extension of the unreality of the situation. It was as if nature itself had inverted its roles, with the wild beast offering solace where humanity had failed. The elderly woman tried to move, a spasm of desperation propelling her numb limbs. A groan escaped her cracked lips as the barbed wire dug even deeper into her flesh. The pain was excruciating, but it wasn't just physical. It was the pain of betrayal, of abandonment, of helplessness. The image of her son, his face indifferent as he left, burned in her mind, a brutal contrast to the silent compassion of the beast before her. What bitter irony it was to be abandoned by her own blood and find a semblance of protection in the eyes of a predator. The tiger, as if sensing her suffering, let out a deep sigh, a sound that vibrated in the air, yet without any threat. Its eyes fixed on her for a long moment, and the elderly woman swore she saw there not just curiosity, but a form of recognition, perhaps even sorrow. It was a gaze that seemed to say, "I see your pain. I understand it." But how could a beast understand the complexity of human cruelty? Hunger began to gnaw at her stomach, a hollow and painful sensation. Her throat was dry, scratching with every attempt to swallow. The forest, which before had been merely a backdrop to her torment, now revealed itself in its cruelest details. The morning dew, which covered the leaves and the ground, seemed unattainable. Every drop of moisture was a mirage. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, once neutral, now accentuated her thirst. The sun rose a little higher, and with it came the sounds of the awakening forest, the distant chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals among the foliage. Sounds that, in other circumstances, would bring peace, now only underscored her isolation and the indifference of the outside world. No one would come, her son would not return. She was alone, save for the albino giant. The elderly woman watched the tiger. It was magnificent, a spectre of power and grace. Its muscles rippled softly beneath its immaculate white fur, and its retractable claws could easily tear through the fence, freeing her. But it did not. Its protection was passive, a barrier against the cold and perhaps against other invisible dangers, but not a solution to her imprisonment. She was trapped prey, and it, the predator, Was merely observing, or was it something more? A small butterfly with blue wings landed on the barbed wire, inches from her face. For a brief instant, the elderly woman forgot the pain, the hunger, the tiger. The creature's delicacy, its freedom, was such a poignant contrast to her own situation that a tear rolled down her dirty face. The tiger, in turn, shifted its gaze from the butterfly to the tear, and an almost imperceptible tremor ran through its body. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of fear, hope, and the strange intimacy that had formed between the woman and the beast. The elderly woman knew she couldn't stay there. The rising sun would bring the heat of the day, and with it, dehydration would become an even greater threat. But how to free herself? And what would happen if the tiger suddenly decided its role as guardian was over? The forest was a labyrinth of dangers, and she was trapped, vulnerable, at the mercy of a nature that by some miracle seemed to have granted her a temporary truce. The truce, however, was fragile, and the next night promised to be even longer if she didn't find a way out. The sun, once a mere herald of the day, now rose in the sky with implacable ferocity. Its rays, once pale, cut through the dense foliage and pierced the elderly woman's skin like incandescent needles. The morning dew had evaporated, taking with it the illusion of coolness. The forest air, once damp and earthy, became heavy, stifling, laden with the acrid smell of dry earth and the promise of a scorching day. Every fiber of her body protested. The pain in her legs, where the barbed wire was embedded with the tenacity of an executioner, had transformed into a pulsating, incessant agony. The dried blood on her wounds, once a dark crust, now seemed to burn, and the surrounding skin was inflamed, hot to the touch. Weakness, which had been an uncomfortable sensation, now dominated her, crushing her under its weight. The elderly woman's throat was raw, every attempt to swallow a torment. Thirst was a fire consuming her insides, drying her mouth and tongue until they felt like sandpaper. She tried to moisten her cracked lips with her tongue, but it was useless. Hunger, once a distant gnawing, was now an empty crater in her stomach, a searing pain added to the others. Her eyes, clouded and bloodshot, scanned the ground for any trace of moisture, any dewy leaf, any sign of life that might offer a palliative. But there was only dry earth and dead leaves, a silent testament to nature's indifference. The albino tiger, her enigmatic guardian, remained a few feet away. Its sapphire eyes, which had been a beacon in the darkness, now reflected the sun's blinding light with an almost supernatural intensity. It did not move, but the elderly woman felt its gaze, heavy and constant, upon her. It was a gaze that did not judge her, did not fear her, nor desired her as prey. It was a gaze of pure observation, of a curiosity that transcended the barrier between species. She wondered what it saw, a fragile, dying creature, or something more, a suffering soul, perhaps. The idea was absurd, but the presence of that majestic animal, so detached from its own predatory nature, planted seeds of doubt in her exhausted mind. The image of her son, his impassive face as he walked away, returned with painful clarity. He left me to die, she thought, and the thought was a poison spreading through her veins, more corrosive than the physical pain. He abandoned me for the beasts to find. The irony was cruel. The beast was there, yes, but not as an executioner, rather as a silent observer, perhaps even a protector. What kind of world was this, where a son was more savage than a predator? A groan escaped her lips, more a lament of despair than of pain. She needed water. She needed to get out of there. Her eyes fixed on the tiger, a silent plea in her gaze. Please, she thought, do something, anything. The feline, as if it had understood the intensity of her mute request, moved. Not a sudden movement, but a fluid, almost ethereal transition. It rose, stretching its muscular body with innate grace, and the elderly woman felt a chill of panic. Was this the end? Had it finally tired of its inaction? The tiger took a step, then another, moving away from her towards the dense foliage of the forest. Each step was a blow to her heart. Fear, previously latent, exploded in her chest. "No!" she tried to scream, but only a hoarse whisper managed to escape. "Don't leave me!" The forest seemed to swallow it, and for a moment she was alone again, terrified, more vulnerable than ever. The heat of the sun seemed to intensify. Thirst tightened its grip. The pain in her legs screamed. The truce was over. The predator had remembered its nature, but then a rustle of leaves. The tiger reappeared, in its mouth with surprising delicacy for an animal of its size. It carried something. It was a large, vibrant green leaf, and upon it, like translucent pearls, rested drops of dew, or perhaps water from a hidden puddle. The feline approached slowly, its sapphire eyes fixed on hers, without any sign of threat. It stopped inches from her face, lowering its head carefully. The leaf, with its precious drops, was now within reach of her hand if she could move. The elderly woman blinked, incredulous. Her heart, which had been beating frantically with panic, now accelerated with a new emotion, a faint, almost unreal hope. The tiger. It had brought her water. A predator, a wild animal, was offering her what her own son had denied. With a monumental effort, she extended her trembling hand, ignoring the searing pain that shot through her arm. Her fingers brushed the leaf, and the tiger did not recoil. It remained motionless, observing her with that enigmatic intensity. She managed to catch one of the drops, bringing it to her dry lips. It was a small amount, but the coolness, the moisture, was a balm for her burning throat. The tiger, seeing that she had drunk, did something even more unexpected. With its muzzle, it pushed the leaf a little closer, as if encouraging her to drink more. Its eyes seemed to soften, and a low sound, almost a purr, vibrated in its chest. The elderly woman, with tears streaming down her dirty face, looked at the beast. There was no malice, no hunger in its eyes. There was compassion. Was it possible? The line between predator and protector had dissolved, and in its place, a strange and deep connection was forming. The forest, once a hell of abandonment, now held a secret, a miracle of wild empathy. But the water on the leaf was only a palliative. She was still trapped, and the sun continued to rise, relentless. The tiger's truce was real, but her freedom, her survival, still depended on an outcome that seemed increasingly impossible. The drop of water, minuscule in its essence, was an ocean of life. The coolness, an electric shock that coursed through her parched throat, brought momentary relief, a welcome truce in the incessant battle against dehydration. The elderly woman closed her eyes, absorbing the sensation. And when she opened them again, the tiger was still there, motionless, the leaf with the remaining pearls of dew still extended. Its sapphire eyes, once enigmatic, now seemed to carry a depth she had never imagined in a beast. It was a gaze that asked for nothing, only offered. With renewed effort, she took another drop and then another, until the leaf was almost dry. Each small portion of moisture was a miracle, an unexpected gift from a creature that, by its nature, should be her tormentor. The irony was a bitter poison. Her own blood, her son, had abandoned her to the mercy of the wilderness and its beasts, but the beast, the most fearsome of all, extended its hand, or rather its leaf. The contrast was brutal, a mirror of the human soul and the savagery that could inhabit both worlds. The tiger, seeing the leaf empty, took a step back, but did not move away. Its eyes did not lose focus on her, and the elderly woman felt that the communication between them transcended words, transcended species. It was a language of intent, of presence. The relief from the water was ephemeral, and the pain in her legs, where the barbed wire dug deeper with every movement, soon dominated her senses again. Weakness was a dense fog obscuring her mind, and the sun, now at its zenith, punished her with relentless ferocity. She looked at the tiger, a silent plea in her eyes. "I can't stay here," she thought, her voice hoarse in her mind. "I'm going to die." The feline, as if reading her thoughts, let out a low sound, a guttural murmur that vibrated in the air, yet without any aggression. It was almost a lament, a response to her pain. It then did something that made her hold her breath. With deliberate slowness, the tiger approached the fence. Its muscles rippled beneath its white fur like waves on a calm sea, but the elderly woman felt the tension in every fiber of her being. It wouldn't attack her, she knew now, but what would it do? It stopped right beside her, so close she could feel the warmth of its massive body, the wild, clean scent of its fur. The tiger's head tilted, its eyes fixed on the barbed wire that held her legs. A tremor ran through the elderly woman's body. She could feel the animal's warm breath on her skin, and for an instant, primal fear tried to reassert itself. But she stifled it. There was something different about this tiger, something that defied all her understanding of nature. It wasn't a monster, it was an ally. The tiger moved one of its front paws. Its claws, long and sharp as ivory daggers, emerged from its pads, gleaming in the sunlight. The elderly woman let out a small cry of panic, but it did not touch her. Instead, with astonishing precision, it inserted one of its claws between the strands of barbed wire, very close to her leg. The metallic sound of the friction made her body stiffen. It pulled, not with brute force but with calculated pressure, as if testing the material's resistance. The barbed wire stretched slightly, groaning in protest, but did not give way. The elderly woman felt a pang of pain as the wire moved, grazing her already wounded skin even more. The tiger drew back its paw, its sapphire eyes still fixed on the obstacle. It seemed to be assessing, thinking. The elderly woman's mind reeled. Was it trying to free her? The idea was so fantastical, so beyond any logic, that she almost laughed in despair. But the evidence was there in the tiger's attempt, in its patience, in its presence. "It's trying," she thought, and a new wave of emotion, a mix of gratitude and terror, overwhelmed her. The tiger tried again, this time with more force. It used both front paws, positioning them carefully on the wire strands. Its muscles contracted, and the elderly woman could see the effort in its body. The barbed wire groaned, stretching further, and one of the strands, under the relentless pressure, finally gave way with a dry snap. A piece of wire broke loose, falling to the ground with a muffled thud. The elderly woman let out a sigh. It was minimal relief, but it was a start. However, the movement of the wire had torn her skin further, and a trickle of fresh blood ran down her leg, mixing with the dried blood. The pain was excruciating, but she ignored it, focused on the tiger, on its determination. The feline, apparently satisfied with the small progress, looked at her. There was an intensity in its gaze, an urgency. It seemed to be saying, "Hold on, I'm trying." But the fence was strong, and the barbed wire, though damaged in one spot, still held her with the tenacity of a cruel trap. The sun continued to burn, and the elderly woman's weakness increased with every passing minute. She knew the tiger couldn't do everything. She needed to help, but how? Her legs were trapped, her arms weak. She tried to move, but the pain paralyzed her. The tiger, sensing her difficulty, let out a low growl, almost an encouragement. It moved away from the fence a bit, and the elderly woman felt a momentary panic. Would it give up? But no. It turned, and with its head, pushed the fence at a different point, testing it. It seemed to be looking for a weak spot, a way to open a passage. The animal's intelligence was astounding, almost human. The forest, which before had seemed indifferent, now silently observed the strange alliance. The birdsong ceased, the small animals quieted. Only the sound of the tiger, the creak of the barbed wire, and the elderly woman's gasping breath broke the silence. The tension was almost unbearable. Her life depended on that predator, that white spectre of power and compassion. But time was running out, and with each passing minute, hope, however strong, seemed more fragile, more distant. The tiger's intelligence was astounding. It wasn't the brute force of a disoriented wild animal, but a calculated application of power, almost methodical. It took a step back, its sapphire eyes scanning the fence with an intensity that seemed to unravel its secrets. The barbed wire, which for the elderly woman was an insurmountable barrier, for it was a riddle to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome. It moved to a new spot, a little further along, where the fence seemed slightly looser. Perhaps a support post was further away. With its head, it pushed, testing the resistance, feeling the vibration of the metal. A low growl, almost a grunt of concentration, escaped its throat. The elderly woman watched, hypnotized, her breath caught in her throat. Every movement of the feline was a ray of hope, but also a constant reminder of her own fragility, of her total dependence. The pain in her leg was a constant, an incessant drumming that echoed in her mind. Fresh blood ran, warm and sticky, mixing with dirt and dried blood. She felt weakness deepen, her body trembling not just from fear, but from exhaustion and dehydration. The sun, now at its peak, felt like an incandescent hammer beating on her head, and the surrounding landscape distorted in heat waves. The tiger, ignoring the blood that stained its own white fur as it brushed against the fence, positioned itself again. This time, it used its muzzle and front paws in conjunction. With its claws retracted, it pushed the barbed wire down, trying to create an opening. The metal creaked, protesting, and the elderly woman felt a pang of pain as the fence moved against her skin. She bit her lip, a groan escaping. But the tiger did not stop. Its eyes were fixed on the task, a fierce determination in every fiber of its being. It pushed harder, the muscles in its neck and shoulders contracting. The barbed wire gave way a little, stretching, and a second strand, under the relentless pressure, snapped and broke. The sound was louder this time, a momentary relief for the elderly woman, but joy was quickly replaced by a new wave of pain. The sudden movement of the wire tore her flesh further, and a new, thicker trickle of blood began to flow. She let out a muffled cry, her head falling back, eyes closed. The weakness was overwhelming. "I can't take it anymore," she thought, her voice almost inaudible in her mind. "I'm going to faint." The tiger, as if sensing her suffering, stopped, its sapphire eyes fixed on her, and it let out a low murmur, almost a lament. There was no anger, only palpable concern. It approached, and with its muzzle, lightly touched her leg, just above the wounded area, a strange and delicate caress for a predator. The tiger, as if understanding the need for a new plan, retreated again. It would not give up. The fence, though damaged in two places, was still a deadly trap. It began to walk along it, sniffing the ground, observing the posts as if looking for a structural flaw, a weaker point that could be exploited. Its patience was infinite, its determination unwavering. The elderly woman, despite the pain and weakness, felt a new wave of admiration. This was not just an animal. It was a creature of intelligence and, yes, compassion. It was risking its own safety, expending its energy for her, for a human who, in its experience, had probably only brought destruction to its world. The tiger stopped at a point where the earth seemed looser around the base of a post. It began to dig, not with the ferocity of a hunting predator, but with the precision of an engineer, its front paws removing the earth with surprising speed and efficiency. Dust rose in small clouds, and the sound of earth being scratched filled the suffocating silence of the afternoon. The elderly woman watched, a renewed yet fragile hope growing in her chest. If it could knock down the post, perhaps the fence would yield enough for her to crawl out. But the idea of moving, of dragging her wounded legs, was almost as terrifying as the prospect of staying there. The tiger dug with vigor, its muscles rippling beneath its skin. Earth flew, revealing the dry roots of some creeping vegetation. The post, once firm, began to sway slightly. The feline, sensing progress, intensified its efforts. It used its muzzle to push the post, testing its stability, and then returned to digging. With each movement, more earth was removed, more of the post's base was exposed. The sun continued to punish, and the elderly woman felt her throat scratch again. The small amount of dew water had already been absorbed by her thirsty body. She needed more, but the tiger was focused on its task. She couldn't ask, couldn't do anything but watch and wait. The forest, once silent, now seemed to vibrate with the tension of the moment. The elderly woman's fate lay in the paws of that predator, a fate her own son had sealed with cruel indifference. The post gave way a little more, leaning precariously. The tiger let out a triumphant growl, a guttural sound that made the ground vibrate. It was close, very close. But what would happen when the post fell? Would she be free or just more injured? The uncertainty was a burden as heavy as the pain. The post, once a pillar of iron and wire, groaned one last time. It wasn't a metallic groan, but a deep lament from the earth that held it. With a dry snap, reverberating through the silent forest like a gunshot, it gave way. The base, now completely exposed, collapsed, and the post toppled to the side, dragging with it an entire section of the fence. The barbed wire, which had previously held her with cruel tenacity, now twisted and bent, creating an irregular opening, a wound in the landscape. The elderly woman let out a muffled cry, not of pain, but of surprise and almost unbearable relief. The sudden movement of the fence as it gave way whipped some strands of wire against her already lacerated leg, opening new, deeper wounds that immediately began to bleed. The pain was excruciating, a liquid fire spreading through her veins, but the sight of the opening, the possibility of freedom, was a balm for her soul. The tiger took a step back, its sapphire eyes fixed on the fallen fence. There was a silent satisfaction in its posture, a confirmation of its success. It did not roar, did not display the ferocity of a victorious predator, but merely observed, like an artisan admiring its work. Then its eyes turned to her, to the trapped woman, still entangled in the loose wires, unable to move. She was half lying, half sitting, propped against the fence that now lay on the ground. Her legs, caught by the wires that had wrapped around her clothes and skin, felt like lead. Every attempt to move sent waves of sharp pain, and her weakness was such that her body trembled uncontrollably. Her head spun, the relentless sun beating on her neck, and her dry mouth felt like sandpaper. The tiger approached again, its steps light and silent, despite its imposing size. It stopped right in front of the opening, its snow-white body contrasting with the red earth and green forest. With its muzzle, it gently pushed away the strands of wire that still held her, moving them from her leg. There was no force, only surprising delicacy, a precision that bordered on miraculous. It seemed to know exactly where and how to apply pressure, avoiding her wounds, clearing a path. The elderly woman watched, hypnotized, her breath caught in her throat. The tiger's scent, a mix of earth, moss, and something wild, filled her senses. She could feel the warmth of its body, the proximity of a predator that, by all laws of nature, should see her as prey. But it did not. It was saving her. The irony was a punch to the gut. Her own son, of her own flesh and blood, had abandoned her. And an albino tiger, a wild and mythical creature, was there, dedicating its strength and intelligence to free her. With its muzzle, the tiger pushed a final strand of wire that was wrapped around her ankle. The wire came loose with a small scratch, and the elderly woman felt immediate relief. but also a new pang of pain as fresh blood flowed. She was free from the fence, but not from the pain, not from the weakness. I can't, she whispered, her voice hoarse and almost inaudible. I can't move. The tiger looked at her, its sapphire eyes seeming to understand. It let out a low murmur, a guttural sound that was not threatening, but seemed like encouragement. Then it did something even more extraordinary. It lowered itself, positioning its body beside her, and with its head, gently nudged her back as if inviting her to lean on it, to use its strength to stand up. The elderly woman hesitated. Fear, a primal remnant, was still there. Lean on a tiger? It was madness, but the alternative was to stay there, wasting away under the sun, bleeding to death. She had no choice. With a monumental effort, she extended her trembling hand, seeking support in the animal's soft, dense fur. The texture was surprisingly smooth, warm, and alive. She felt the powerful muscles beneath her fingers, the contained strength that could crush her in an instant. With the tiger's help, which gently pushed her, she managed to sit up, leaning against its flank. The pain was excruciating, but the feeling of being free from the fence, of having support, was a miracle. She was out, but she was still in the middle of nowhere, wounded, dehydrated, and with an albino tiger as her only companion. The tiger, sensing that she was sitting, let out another murmur. It turned slightly, and with its muzzle gently nudged her forward, indicating the direction of the forest, of shade, perhaps of water. It would not abandon her now. It had pulled her from the trap, and now seemed determined to guide her to safety. But with each movement, the elderly woman felt darkness approaching. Her eyes blurred, the world around her spun. The forest, once a hell of heat and despair, now seemed a distant, unattainable paradise. She needed water, she needed medical help, and the tiger, however intelligent and compassionate, could not provide that. Water, she murmured, the word almost a sigh. I need water. The tiger stopped, turning its head to look at her. Its sapphire eyes seemed to pierce her soul, as if trying to understand her words, her need. It let out a low growl, almost thoughtful, and then, to her surprise, it began to walk. Not towards the forest, but in a slightly different direction, as if it had understood her request and was looking for something. Hope, however fragile, reignited in her chest, a flickering flame against the wind of despair. But how much longer could she endure? The sun still punished, and the darkness in her mind threatened to swallow her at any moment. The tiger, its white fur shimmering under the merciless sun, began to move. It wasn't a hurried pace, but a deliberate, almost careful walk, as if aware of the fragility of the burden it, in a way, carried. The elderly woman, leaning against its flank, felt every muscle of the animal rippling beneath her fingers, a wild, contained strength that propelled her forward. Each step of the tiger was a challenge for her. The pain in her legs was an orchestra of needles and knives. Every movement hurt. Every fiber of her being protested. The world spun. The forest trees blended into green and brown blurs, and the blue sky seemed like a flaming sheet. She gritted her teeth, biting her lip not to scream, not to faint. Darkness threatened to swallow her, but the tiger's presence, its silent determination, was an anchor amidst the chaos. It guided her through the undergrowth, avoiding thorns and fallen branches with surprising dexterity. The smell of dry earth, brush, and the tiger itself filled her nostrils, an intoxicating mixture of life and danger. She could feel the warmth of its body, the constant rhythm of its breathing, and for a moment, the line between fear and trust dissolved. This predator, this king of the jungle, was her only hope. The irony continued to pound in her mind. The son she raised, whom she loved, abandoned her, and the wild animal, which by nature should hunt her, was saving her. The sun continued to punish, and thirst was a constant torture. Her throat was raw, her mouth dry as sand. She tried to murmur again, "Water." But no voice came, only a dry hiss. The tiger, as if sensing her anguish, let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to be of encouragement. It slightly increased its pace, its sapphire eyes fixed on an invisible point ahead, as if it knew exactly where to go. The forest began to change subtly. The vegetation became a little denser, the shadows deeper. The air, once stifling and stagnant, seemed to carry an almost imperceptible coolness. The elderly woman, in her semi-delirious state, wondered if she was imagining it. Was it a trick of the mind, a mirage of her hopelessness? But the tiger continued, unwavering, and with each step, the sensation of moisture seemed to intensify. Suddenly the tiger stopped. It let out a more prolonged murmur, almost a call. The elderly woman with blurred vision tried to focus. Ahead, among a tangle of exposed roots and moss-covered stones, there was a gleam that was not from the sun. It was water, a small puddle, dark and still, but undeniably water. It wasn't a bubbling stream, nor a crystal-clear spring, but it was water. Hope erupted in her chest like a wildflower, painful and beautiful. She tried to detach herself from the tiger, but her legs wouldn't respond. The tiger, sensing her intention, gently lowered itself, allowing her to slide to the ground with minimal impact. The pain was excruciating, but the sight of the water propelled her. She began to crawl, dragging herself with her arms, ignoring the wounds that opened and bled anew. The tiger watched, its eyes fixed on her without moving. It did not drink. It merely observed her, like a silent guardian. She reached the puddle, her trembling hands plunging into the cold, muddy water. The dirt didn't matter. The earthy taste didn't matter. It was water. She brought her hands to her mouth, swallowing eagerly, feeling life slowly return to her veins. The coolness was a balm for her burning throat, for her mind ablaze. She drank and drank until nausea threatened. When she finally lifted her head, gasping, she felt a renewed strength, however faint. The world seemed a little less blurred, the pain a little less acute. She looked at the tiger, which was still observing her. There was such profound gratitude in her gaze that words seemed empty. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still hoarse but audible. The tiger let out a low growl, almost a purr. It approached the puddle, but instead of drinking, it merely sniffed the water, and then, to her surprise, it began to sniff the ground around, its whiskers moving with precision. There was something more, something beyond the water. The elderly woman, still weak, tried to follow its gaze. Among the roots of an ancient tree, half hidden by vegetation, there was a small cave. It wasn't large, just a dark recess in the rock, but it seemed to offer shelter. The tiger looked at her, then at the cave, and let out another murmur, as if inviting her. It was a place to hide from the sun, perhaps to spend the night. But it was also a predator's den. Fear, which had been suppressed by thirst and pain, began to creep back. She was stronger, but still vulnerable. And now, the tiger was inviting her into its own refuge. The decision was an abyss, to fully trust the predator that saved her, or to risk herself again at the mercy of the forest and its invisible dangers. Night was approaching, and with it, the cold and the sounds of the hunt. The cave, a dark recess in the rock, promising shelter, but also a predator's den. The elderly woman felt fear, a chilling shiver that had nothing to do with the night breeze beginning to blow. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, to get away from that place of darkness and danger. But where? To the forest that was becoming an indistinct mass of shadows and threatening sounds. To the open field where the sun had punished her and where night would bring the cold and even more invisible predators. She looked at the tiger. Its sapphire eyes, now more intense in the growing gloom, seemed to invite her, not with threat, but with a strange form of solicitude. It had just saved her, guided her to water. It hadn't attacked her, not even a growl of impatience. Logic, however absurd it seemed, pointed to trust. Exhaustion was a heavy burden. Every muscle ached, and the idea of spending the night exposed, with her body wounded and mind on the verge of collapse, was more terrifying than the proximity of a tiger. With a sigh that seemed to tear her throat, she made her choice. There was no choice, in truth. It was the tiger or certain death. She began to crawl again, her arms dragging her aching body towards the dark entrance. The tiger moved, not to obstruct, but to step back slightly, giving her space, as if it understood her hesitation and respected her pace. It watched her with the same silent attention, its whiskers vibrating slightly. The cave entrance was narrow, requiring her to contort herself to pass through. The air inside was cooler, with a smell of damp earth and, yes, the strong, wild scent of the tiger. The darkness was almost total, but her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, began to distinguish shapes. It was a small cave, a kind of natural alcove, with a dirt floor and cold rock walls. There were no signs of bones or prey remains, which calmed her a little. Perhaps it wasn't a permanent den, but just a temporary refuge, just as it was for her. She crawled to the back, leaning against the cold rock wall. The pain in her legs was a constant pulsation, and the dried blood on her wounds began to pull. But the relief of being out of the biting wind, protected from the stars beginning to appear in the sky, was immense. The tiger entered next, moving with a silent grace that belied its size. It lay down near the entrance, blocking most of the remaining twilight. Its sapphire eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching her. The elderly woman cowered, trying to make herself as small as possible. The animal's proximity was overwhelming. She could hear its deep, constant breathing, feel the warmth of its body filling the small space. It was a forced intimacy, a dangerous dance between predator and prey, where roles had been strangely inverted. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart. Outside, night brought its own sounds, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of nocturnal insects, and, more distantly, a solitary howl that made her hairs stand on end. The forest was alive, and she was in its heart, vulnerable, wounded, and protected by a miracle of white fur. The irony was a sweet poison in her mind. Her son, her own blood, had left her to die, a stain of selfishness and cruelty. And this animal, this wild king, was there, her improbable guardian. What kind of world was this, where nature proved more compassionate than humanity? She felt the cold creep into her bones. The dampness of the cave, once a relief from the day's heat, now seemed to amplify the cold. Her teeth began to chatter. She needed warmth, food, a dressing for her wounds. But all she had was the silent presence of the tiger. The tiger, as if sensing her discomfort, let out a low murmur. It moved slightly, turning so its body was closer to hers, offering a barrier against the cold from the entrance. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, but the elderly woman felt the warmth radiating from its dense fur. She hesitated for a moment, but the cold was relentless. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she reached out and touched the tiger's flank. The fur was even softer than she remembered, and the warmth was a balm. She allowed herself to lean closer, absorbing the animal's heat, feeling the vibration of its powerful muscles. Exhaustion finally caught up with her. The pain, the thirst, the fear, the strangeness of the situation, all merged into a dense fog. Her eyes felt heavy. She was at the mercy of the tiger, yes, but she was also safe for now. The contrast with the barbed wire fence with her son's abandonment was stark. She was with a predator, but she didn't feel hunted. She felt protected. As the cave's darkness deepened and the sounds of night intensified outside, the elderly woman nestled against the tiger's warmth, felt consciousness slip away. She didn't know what dawn would bring, nor how she would get out of this situation. But for that night, she was alive. And that, in itself, was a miracle. The tiger remained vigilant, its sapphire eyes sweeping the darkness, a silent sentinel against the dangers the forest held. The night would be long, and trust, however fragile, would be the only bridge between life and death. The night dragged on, a dark and damp eternity inside the small cave. The elderly woman didn't truly sleep, not in the restorative sense her exhausted body craved. She slipped into a state of semi-consciousness, a dense fog, where physical pain mingled with a whirlwind of thoughts and the threatening sounds of the forest. The tiger's warmth was an anchor, a massive and paradoxically comforting presence against the cold that crept along the stone walls. Every rustle of leaves outside, every snap of a twig, every distant chirp of a nocturnal insect was amplified in the darkness, transforming into an omen of danger. She felt the tiger's body tense slightly with each sharper sound, a subtle vibration that ran through its fur and reached her. It was a constant reminder that although sheltered, the wild world outside was in full activity, and she was a fragile intruder. At one point, a long, melancholic howl tore through the night silence, closer than any other sound. The tiger stiffened completely. The elderly woman felt a low, guttural growl vibrate deep in its chest, a sound not of anger, but of alert, of territorial dominance. Her own hairs stood on end, and she held her breath, wondering what creature could provoke such a reaction in the albino king. The tiger remained motionless for long minutes. Its sapphire eyes, even in almost total darkness, seemed to sweep the cave entrance as if it could see through the night. Slowly, the tension in its body lessened, and the elderly woman released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The danger, for now, had passed or moved away. In these moments of forced vigil, her mind relentlessly returned to her son. His image, diminishing on the horizon, leaving her trapped and bleeding, was an open wound in her soul. How could compassion be so selective, so absent in her own blood? The contrast was stark, almost unbearable. Her son, the man she had raised with so much love and sacrifice, had abandoned her to death. And this animal, this wild predator, was there, her improbable guardian, offering warmth and protection. It was an irony so bitter it made her question the very nature of humanity, the cruelty of man versus the strange, unexpected kindness of the beast. She felt the constant pulsation of pain in her legs, the pulling of the dried wounds, but the fear of moving away from the tiger's warmth was greater than the discomfort. She was at its mercy, yes, but she was also safe, in a way she could never have foreseen. With each deep breath of the animal, with each subtle movement of its body, she felt a strange connection deepen, a trust that defied logic and reason. The hours dragged on, marked only by the subtle change in the forest sounds and the gradual decrease of the most intense cold. Finally, an almost imperceptible clarity began to tint the cave entrance. The absolute black of night gave way to a deep grey, and the first timid birdsongs began to replace the nocturnal chorus of insects and predators. Dawn was coming. With the light came a new wave of apprehension. What would the day bring? Would the strange truce of the night end with the sunlight? Would the tiger maintain its vigil, or would its primal instincts reassert themselves, seeing her again as prey? She was still weak, wounded, and completely lost. The puddle water had been a balm, but she needed food, help, a way out of that green hell. With a groan, she tried to move, feeling every muscle protest. The morning air was fresh, damp, laden with the smell of wet earth and dense vegetation. The world outside was awakening, and she would have to face it. She opened her eyes, blinking against the faint light. The tiger was still there, an imposing white silhouette against the cave entrance. Its eyes, now less intense in the growing gloom, were fixed on her. There was no aggression, no hunger, just that same enigmatic observation. The silence between them was filled with the unasked question, what now? The tiger had saved her, sheltered her, but it was still a wild beast, and she, a fragile, wounded woman. The next steps were an abyss of uncertainty, a leap of faith into the heart of the jungle, with only a predator as her guide. Trust, however fragile, had become her only bridge to survival. The faint light announcing dawn filtered into the cave, painting the deep grey with the first hues of a new day. For the elderly woman, each ray of light was a double-edged sword. It promised the end of darkness and the most intense cold, but also brought back the harsh reality of her situation. The night's truce, nestled against the tiger's warmth, seemed about to unravel. What would the day bring? Would the beast maintain its strange benevolence, or would primal instincts reassert themselves, seeing her again as easy prey? She opened her eyes, blinking against the growing light. The tiger, an imposing white silhouette, was still there, blocking most of the entrance. Its sapphire eyes, now less intense in the receding gloom, were fixed on her. There was no aggression, no explicit hunger, just that same enigmatic observation. The silence between them was filled with the unasked question, what now? The elderly woman's body groaned in protest. Every muscle seemed to have turned to stone, and the wounds on her legs pulled with a constant throbbing pain. Thirst was sandpaper in her throat, and hunger, an empty hole in her stomach. She needed water, food, a way out of that green hell. But the fear of moving, of breaking the delicate bubble of safety the tiger had created, was paralyzing. Outside, the forest awoke with a symphony of sounds. The cheerful chirping of birds replaced the nocturnal chorus of insects and predators. The morning air was fresh, damp, laden with the smell of wet earth and dense vegetation. The world was alive, pulsating, and she would have to face it. The tiger let out a deep sigh, a sound that vibrated through its massive body and reached the elderly woman. Then, with a deliberate slowness that seemed to calculate every movement, it rose. The elderly woman instinctively cowered, her heart racing. But the tiger did not turn to her. Instead, it moved to the cave entrance, stopping there, its head slightly tilted outwards. It looked outside for a moment, then turned its head back, its eyes fixed on her, as if inviting her to follow. It was a mute, yet unmistakable, invitation. A step into the unknown, into the uncertainty of the day. Fear overwhelmed her. What if it was a trap? What if it was leading her to a place where it could finally satisfy its hunger? But the alternative was to stay there, wasting away from hunger and thirst, at the mercy of her own weakness. Life, even if by a thread, was stronger than fear. With a groan of effort, she began to crawl. Every movement was torture, but the need to survive was a more powerful engine than pain. She crawled out of the cave, the morning sunlight, still soft and filtered by the trees, hitting her eyes. The outside world was a vibrant green blur. The smell of the forest was overwhelming, a mix of earth-damp leaves and wild odors. The tiger waited. It did not move away, did not rush her. It merely observed, a silent sentinel. When she finally managed to crawl out of the cave, it began to walk, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. It did not look back, but its pace was slow, almost as if it were waiting for her to follow. She had no choice. With pain hammering in her legs and her throat dry, she followed. Every inch was a battle. Dry branches scratched her hands and knees, damp earth clung to her wounds, but the sight of the tiger's white tail, swaying gently ahead, was her only compass, her only hope. The forest was dense, a green labyrinth of towering trees and undergrowth. The sounds were constant, the chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, the rustling of leaves beneath her feet. She felt small, insignificant, at the mercy of every shadow, every movement. But the tiger was there, a shield of white fur against invisible danger. They walked for what seemed an eternity. The pain intensified, exhaustion threatened to fell her. She was about to give up, to throw herself on the ground and wait for the end when the tiger stopped. It was near a small stream, crystal clear water flowing softly over the stones. The sight of the water was a balm for her soul. With a last effort, she crawled to the bank, plunging her trembling hands into the cold current. The water was icy, invigorating. She drank avidly, feeling life slowly return to her body. The tiger watched, lying a few feet away, its eyes fixed on her, but without any sign of threat. As she drank, the elderly woman felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. There she was, a woman abandoned by her own son, being guided and protected by a wild predator. The irony was so profound, it almost made her weep. Her son, the man she had loved and raised, had left her to die. And this animal, this king of the jungle, was there, her improbable guardian, showing her a compassion that humanity had denied. Trust, however fragile, had become her only bridge to survival. She didn't know where the tiger would lead her, nor what the day would bring, but for now, she was alive, and she was not alone. The tiger, as if sensing her silent gratitude, let out a low murmur. It was a sound not of a beast, but of a companion, a guide. And in that moment, in the vastness of that merciless forest, it was all she had. The water, cold and pure, flowed down her parched throat like a balm, a breath of life into a body that seemed to be falling apart. Each sip was a promise, a small miracle in the vastness of that green hell. The elderly woman felt a wave of fragile yet real energy course through her veins. It wasn't enough to heal her wounds or erase the exhaustion consuming her, but it was enough to ward off the imminent shadow of dehydration. She raised her eyes to the tiger, which watched her from its relaxed position a few feet away. Its sapphire eyes, once enigmatic, now seemed to carry a strange understanding, almost a patience. The irony of the situation tightened her chest. Her son, her own flesh and blood, had abandoned her to the mercy of death. And there she was, a fragile, wounded woman, being guided and protected by a wild predator, a king of the jungle who, for some unfathomable reason, had chosen to be her guardian. Humanity had failed her, but nature, in its wildest and most unpredictable form, was extending a hand, or rather a paw. It was a truth as bitter as the pain in her legs, but also an unexpected source of strength. Thirst had been quenched, but hunger now gnawed at her stomach with renewed intensity. She felt her body clamor for food, for something that could sustain the little life still left in her. The tiger, as if sensing the new urgency, rose with the same fluid grace as before. It did not rush her, merely waited, its eyes fixed on the forest ahead. It was a mute yet clear invitation. The journey continued. With a groan of effort, the elderly woman stood up, leaning on a nearby tree trunk. Her legs trembled, each step was an agony. But the sight of the tiger's white tail, swaying gently as it moved, was her only anchor, her only hope. She followed it, one painful step at a time, through the dense vegetation. The forest seemed even more alive under the morning sun. The rays of light filtering through the treetops, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor. The tiger maintained a steady pace, slow enough for her to keep up, yet determined. It seemed to know exactly where it was going, moving with an unwavering confidence that inspired a strange faith in the elderly woman. She trusted it, a trust that defied all logic and instinct for self-preservation. But what else did she have? Her son had taught her that human logic could be cruel and treacherous. Perhaps the logic of the jungle, however brutal, could offer a different form of salvation. Suddenly the tiger stopped. Its muscles tensed and the tip of its tail twitched slightly. It was alert, its sapphire eyes fixed on something in the distance. The elderly woman felt a shiver run down her spine. Danger was near. She cowered, seeking shelter behind a dense bush, her heart beating wildly. The tiger let out a low growl, almost inaudible, a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. Then, with surprising agility, it crept forward, disappearing into the foliage. The elderly woman was left alone, the forest's silence suddenly heavy, filled only by the sound of her own gasping breath. Fear overwhelmed her. Had it abandoned her? Was this the moment when primal instincts would finally prevail, and it would leave her behind, easy prey for whatever was lurking? The minutes dragged like hours. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch seemed to announce a threat. She was on the verge of despair, the image of her son reappearing in her mind, the cruelty of his abandonment echoing in the solitude of that moment. But then, a different sound broke the silence. A sharp cry, followed by a deeper growl, and then the unmistakable sound of something being dragged through the vegetation. The tiger reappeared, emerging from the foliage with prey in its mouth, a small, reddish-brown deer. It gently laid it on the ground, a few feet from her, and then turned, its eyes fixed on her again. There was no pride in its posture, no ferocity. Only an observant stillness. The elderly woman looked at the deer, then at the tiger. A wave of shock hit her, followed by a slow and overwhelming understanding. It had hunted for her, a woman it barely knew, a fragile and strange creature in its domain. The image was surreal, almost biblical. The predator, the guardian, the provider. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and uncontrollable, streaming down the wrinkles of her face. They were not tears of pain or fear, but of a gratitude so profound it choked her. She had been abandoned by her own blood, but was being cared for by a wild beast. The dichotomy was stark, the lesson brutal. She knew she needed to eat, but the idea of consuming raw meat was repulsive. However, hunger was a force more powerful than disgust. With trembling hands, she tried to tear a piece of the meat, but her nails were weak, her fingers sore. The tiger, as if sensing her difficulty, let out a low murmur and, with surprising delicacy for an animal of its size, used one of its paws to tear a smaller, more accessible piece of the prey, gently pushing it towards her. It was a gesture that transcended communication, an act of compassion that left her breathless. She took the piece of meat, feeling its warmth and wild scent. With immense effort, she brought it to her mouth, chewing with difficulty. The taste was strange, metallic, but the energy it promised was irresistible. She ate under the tiger's vigilant and silent gaze, feeling life slowly and painfully return to her body. In that moment, in the merciless vastness of the jungle, the elderly woman understood that survival was not just about physical strength, but about the ability to accept the unexpected, to find light where there was only darkness, and to trust where reason dictated the opposite. The tiger was not just her guardian, it was her teacher, teaching her lessons that her son, in his wealth and selfishness, could never have conceived. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone. And somehow, that was enough to continue. The meat, though raw and strange, brought with it a wave of primal warmth, a wild energy that spread through her veins. It wasn't the comfort of a home-cooked meal, but the pure, brutal promise of survival. She felt her stomach protest for a brief moment, a spasm of nausea that quickly gave way to a feeling of satiety, of raw strength. The metallic taste lingered, but hunger, That relentless beast that had tormented her for days finally receded. She looked at the tiger, which still observed her, its sapphire eyes reflecting the filtered light of the forest. There was no judgment, only an ancient stillness and an acceptance of the cycle of life. It had hunted for her, an act of provision that defied all her understanding of the world. With hands still trembling, but now with a new determination, she stood up. Her legs still ached, her wounds throbbed, but the exhaustion that had threatened to fell her seemed to have lessened somewhat. There was a new resilience in her fragile body, an echo of the strength the tiger radiated. The deer lay on the ground, a grim reminder of the food chain, but also a symbol of her unexpected salvation. The tiger, as if sensing her renewed energy, let out a low murmur and began to walk again, its pace slow and deliberate, inviting her to follow. The forest seemed to have transformed. The sounds, once menacing, now sounded like a wild symphony. The rustling of leaves, the distant birdsong, the murmur of the stream, all blended into a sonic tapestry that for a brief moment didn't seem so hostile. She followed it, her eyes fixed on the white tail swaying gently ahead. Each step was a battle, but now there was a purpose, a direction that hadn't existed before. She wasn't just fleeing death. She was following life, guided by a creature humanity would have labeled a monster. The sun began to descend, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the temperature began to drop. The forest, once illuminated, plunged into long, distorted shadows. The air grew damper, and a smell of wet earth and moss hung in the air. The elderly woman felt a shiver run down her spine. Night in the jungle was a danger in itself, a veil that hid predators and revealed the deepest fears. She wondered if the tiger would lead her to another shelter, another cave. They walked for some more time, the silence of the impending night becoming almost deafening. Suddenly, the tiger stopped. Its muscles tensed and it raised its head, sniffing the air. Its sapphire eyes, now almost luminous in the gloom, fixed on something ahead, something the elderly woman couldn't see, but whose presence she felt. A low, guttural growl escaped its throat, a sound not of warning but of alert, of readiness. The elderly woman cowered, her heart beating wildly. What was it now? A larger predator? A group of hunters? Her imagination, fueled by fear, painted terrifying scenarios. The tiger, however, did not retreat. Instead, it advanced slowly, its steps silent, almost as if merging with the shadows. She followed, unable to do anything else, the trust she had placed in it now tested to its limit. They approached a clearing, and the elderly woman finally saw what had caught the tiger's attention. It wasn't another animal, but a human encampment. A campfire crackled faintly, and smoke spiraled up into the night sky. There were voices, low and indistinct, and the silhouettes of some makeshift tents. Poachers, gold prospectors. The human presence, which in other circumstances would be a sign of salvation, now seemed as great a threat as any beast. The tiger stopped at the edge of the clearing, hidden by the dense foliage. It made no sound, merely observed, its eyes fixed on the encampment. The elderly woman felt a wave of despair. If they were good people, perhaps they could help her. But what if they weren't? What if they saw the tiger? Her mind reeled with the possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. She had been abandoned by her son, and now found herself on the verge of an encounter with other humans, not knowing if they would be saviors or something worse. The tiger let out a soft snort, almost a sigh, and then, to her surprise, began to retreat, moving with the same caution with which it had approached. It did not look at her, but its movement was clear. They would not approach. The elderly woman felt a relief mixed with a pang of disappointment. The chance of rescue had passed, but so had the immediate threat. The tiger was choosing safety, discretion. It was not just a guide, it was a strategist, a protector who assessed dangers and made decisions. They moved away from the encampment, plunging back into the darkness of the forest. The elderly woman felt a weight in her chest. Her son, with all his money and influence, had thrown her into a hell. And this tiger, a wild animal, was there, protecting her not only from the dangers of nature, but also from the dangers of humanity itself. The irony was a bitter blow. She had waited her whole life for her son to protect her, to love her, but it was a predator that showed her the true meaning of care. Night fell completely, and the forest became a labyrinth of sounds and shadows. The tiger continued to guide her, its pace unwavering. She didn't know where it was leading her, but trust, now deeper than ever, propelled her forward. It was her compass, her shadow, her guardian. And in the vastness of that merciless jungle, it was all she had, and all she needed. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone. And somehow, that was enough to continue, one step at a time in the darkness. The darkness of the forest swallowed them whole. The trail of smoke from the human campfire dissolved into the damp air, and the indistinct voices were replaced by the jungle's nocturnal chorus. Every rustling leaf, every snapping branch seemed amplified in the absence of light, transforming the environment into a symphony of veiled threats. The elderly woman felt the night's cold penetrate her bones, a constant reminder of her fragility. The wounds on her legs, though less painful after the strange meal, throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. The tiger, however, seemed immune to the darkness and cold. Its movements were fluid, its majestic silhouette barely visible in the gloom, guiding her through terrain she could never have navigated alone. She followed it, her eyes fixed on the white patch of its tail, her only compass in that labyrinth of shadows. The trust she had placed in it was now absolute, a complete surrender to instinct and survival. Her son, with all his power and wealth, had left her to die. This predator, on the other hand, was choosing life for her, step by step, moment by moment. The irony was a sweet and bitter poison in her mind. They walked for what seemed an eternity. The air grew denser, laden with the smell of wet earth and the pungent sweetness of night-blooming flowers. Suddenly, the tiger stopped. There was no growl, no alert, only an absolute stillness, its muscles tense, head raised, sniffing the air. The elderly woman stopped behind it, her heart beating like a frantic drum. What did it sense? What did the darkness hide now? A distant sound broke the silence. The long, melancholic howl of a wolf, not a solitary wolf, but a chorus echoing through the forest. The elderly woman shivered. She knew wolves hunted in packs, and the idea of being cornered by them was terrifying. The tiger, however, remained motionless, its sapphire eyes fixed in some invisible direction. It did not seem frightened, but rather assessing, calculating. With a slow and deliberate movement, the tiger began to deviate from its previous path, entering an even denser area of vegetation. It seemed to be circumventing the source of the howls, choosing a safer, more hidden path. The elderly woman followed, dragging her tired feet, her torn clothes snagging on thorns and branches. Each scratch was a little more pain, but the threat of the wolves was a powerful incentive to continue. They delved deeper into a tangle of vines and bushes until the moonlight, previously faint, was completely blocked by the foliage. The tiger then made a low sound, a kind of guttural murmur she had never heard before. It turned, and with its head indicated a dark opening amidst a rock formation. It was a small cave, or perhaps a recess in the rock face, hidden by vegetation. The elderly woman hesitated for a moment. Entering a cave in the jungle seemed dangerous, an invitation to be cornered. But the tiger was already moving inside, its silhouette disappearing into the darkness. She had no choice. With a sigh of exhaustion, she crawled inside, smelling the damp earth and strangely a faint feline odor that was not unpleasant. The interior was small, but offered shelter. The floor was packed earth, and the rock walls seemed to absorb the night's cold. The tiger lay down near the entrance, its massive body blocking most of the opening, creating a barrier against the outside world. Its eyes, now mere points of light in the darkness, fixed on her. She sat, leaning against the cold cave wall. Exhaustion hit her like a wave, and she felt her muscles relax despite the pain. The relative safety of that small refuge was a balm for her tormented soul. She looked at the tiger, which now seemed to be dozing, but with a latent vigilance in every fiber of its being. How many days had passed since her son abandoned her? She had lost count. The life she knew of luxury, comfort, and convenience now seemed a distant dream, a memory of another existence. She had been stripped of everything, reduced to her most primal form, dependent on a beast to survive. And yet, she had never felt so alive, so connected to the raw reality of existence. Tears, which she thought had dried, returned. But they were not tears of sadness or despair. They were tears of a strange and profound gratitude, of a resigned acceptance of her fate. She had found a guardian where she least expected it, a lesson in compassion and provision that her son could never have taught her. The tiger let out a soft sigh, almost a purr, and adjusted its position. The sound was comforting, a reminder of its constant presence. The elderly woman closed her eyes, feeling the faint warmth emanating from the animal's body. Hunger was still a pang, but not the same agony as before. Thirst was a concern, but for now shelter and safety were enough. She fell asleep, an uneasy and fragmented slumber, but deeper than any she had had in the jungle. Her dreams were populated by images of her son, his indifferent face, and then the gleam of the tiger's sapphire eyes, the only beacon in her darkness. The night was long, and the jungle continued its relentless life outside. But inside that small cave, under the protection of her unexpected guardian, she found a precarious peace. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone. And somehow that was enough to continue, one step at a time in the darkness, towards an uncertain dawn. The timid grey light of dawn crept into the cave, drawing soft contours on the damp rocks. The elderly woman awoke slowly, not from a restorative sleep, but from an exhausted torpor where her mind refused to process reality. Every muscle ached, every joint protested, but there was a strange stillness in her body, a remnant of the precarious peace she had found under the tiger's protection. The smell of wet earth and the feline odor were more present now, mingling with the fresh air that entered. She opened her eyes, blinking against the gloom. The tiger was there, an imposing mass of white and black near the entrance, its sapphire eyes open and fixed on her. There was no threat, only a silent vigilance, a constant presence that had become the new center of her universe. Hunger was a sharp pang, but thirst was a growing agony, scraping her throat, turning her mouth into a desert. She tried to move, and a groan escaped her cracked lips. The wounds on her legs throbbed, a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. The tiger let out a low snort, almost inaudible, and rose with surprising grace for its size. It stretched, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its skin, and then looked towards the cave opening, as if assessing the world outside. The sound of birds began to fill the forest, a symphony of life that contrasted with the deadly silence of the night. It was a new day, and with it, the promise of new challenges and dangers. With a final glance at the elderly woman, the tiger moved out of the cave, its majestic silhouette disappearing into the dense vegetation. She knew what this meant. There was no time for prolonged rest, nor for lamentations. Survival demanded movement, demanded that she follow. With a monumental effort, She crawled out, feeling the cold dew on the leaves and the pungent smell of damp earth. The sun had not yet penetrated the tree canopy, and the forest remained in a state of eternal twilight. The tiger waited for her, standing a few feet away, its white tail swaying gently, a beacon in the gloom. She rose, staggering, and began to follow it, one painful step after another. With each movement, thirst intensified, a constant burning that overshadowed all other pains. She needed water desperately. They walked for what seemed an endless time. The terrain was treacherous, exposed roots and creeping vines threatening to trip her with every step. The tiger, however, seemed to know exactly where to go, avoiding obstacles with an ease that made her feel even more clumsy and fragile. The forest was a green and damp labyrinth, and without it she would be lost in minutes. Suddenly, the tiger stopped. Its ears twitched, catching sounds she couldn't discern. It sniffed the air, its sapphire eyes fixed on something invisible. The elderly woman stopped behind it, her heart pounding in her chest. What was it now? A new predator? The memory of the wolves from the previous night still haunted her. But the tiger did not retreat. Instead, it advanced slowly, with heightened caution, leading her to a small clearing where the sunlight finally managed to penetrate, revealing a narrow, crystal-clear stream. The sight of the water was like a balm for her parched soul. A groan of relief escaped her lips, and she began to crawl towards the bank. But the tiger let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that made her stop instantly. It wasn't growling at her, but at something beyond, something it sensed but she couldn't see. Its eyes were fixed on the opposite bank of the stream, where the earth was soft and damp. She followed its gaze and saw footprints, not animal tracks, but boot prints. And they weren't old tracks. They were fresh, marking the mud. A shiver ran down her spine. Poachers, gold prospectors, the same ones they had avoided the previous night. The water, so close, so vital, now seemed poisoned by human presence. The tiger, with its instinctive intelligence, had detected the danger even before she could comprehend it. It knew that water was a necessity, but also a meeting point, a place where danger lurked. It turned to her, its sapphire eyes conveying a clear message. It wasn't safe. Thirst consumed her, but fear was a crueler master. She trusted it, trusted its judgment. With a sigh of bitter disappointment, she turned away from the stream, her eyes fixed on the footprints that represented the most treacherous threat of all, that of humanity itself. The tiger guided her away from the stream into an even denser area of the forest, where the vegetation formed an almost impenetrable canopy. Thirst was torture, but the lesson was clear. Survival, sometimes, demanded sacrifices that seemed impossible. Her son had abandoned her to a slow death, and now the irony was that the life she was trying to preserve was being denied by a predator protecting her from other humans. They continued their journey, the forest's silence broken only by the rustle of leaves beneath their feet and the distant sound of something she couldn't identify. It was a metallic, intermittent sound that seemed to come from somewhere ahead. The tiger, once again, stopped. Its muscles were tense, its head raised, sniffing the air with an intensity that made her hold her breath. The metallic sound grew clearer, now accompanied by voices, louder and more distinct than those of the previous night. They weren't the voices of poachers. There was a tone of command, of organization, and the metallic sound. It wasn't from mining tools. It was something heavier, more industrial. The elderly woman felt a chill in her stomach. What could it be? A new threat, or perhaps an unexpected chance for rescue? Her heart beat wildly, torn between hope and terror. The tiger, her silent guardian, seemed as uncertain as she, its sapphire eyes fixed in the direction of the sound, assessing the unknown danger approaching. The journey was far from over, and with each step, the jungle revealed new layers of mystery and threat. The metallic sound, once distant, now grew sharper, cutting through the damp quiet of the forest. It wasn't the rustling of leaves nor the bird song. It was a harsh, intermittent noise, mingling with human voices, louder and more aggressive than those of the previous night. The elderly woman felt every beat in her chest, a drum of fear and uncertainty. What could it be? Her heart, already so battered, wavered between the faint hope of rescue and the terror of a new threat. The tiger, her silent guardian, was tense. Its powerful muscles contracted beneath its white hide, and its raised head sniffed the air with an intensity that made her hold her breath. Its sapphire eyes, once a beacon of safety, now reflected a primal caution, fixed in the direction of the sound, assessing the unknown danger approaching. It was not just a protector, it was a living sensor, an extension of the jungle itself, and its unease was a warning. They advanced, each step an act of faith and despair. The vegetation grew sparser, the trees less dense, as if the forest were recoiling from something. The smell of damp earth began to mix with an acrid odor of smoke and diesel fuel, a strange and artificial scent that did not belong in that place. The voices grew clearer, now accompanied by the intermittent roar of engines and the sharp whine of chainsaws. The elderly woman felt an icy shiver run down her spine. It wasn't a prospector's camp. It was something much larger, more organized, more destructive. Suddenly the tiger stopped, crouching down. Its sapphire eyes narrowed, fixed on a point ahead. The elderly woman, following its gaze, saw a clearing, but not a natural clearing. It was an open wound in the forest. Gigantic trees lay on the ground, their massive trunks stripped of branches, waiting to be dragged away. Heavy machinery, winches and tractors were scattered across the area, their vibrant colors clashing with the green and brown of the jungle. Men, small and brutal in their dirty shirts, wielded chainsaws, their roars echoing through the forest. Some carried rifles slung over their shoulders or propped against piles of wood. It was an illegal logging operation, a large-scale devastation. The sight hit her like a punch to the gut. These were not saviors. They were predators of a different kind, destroying the sanctuary that had taken her in. The hope of rescue crumbled to ashes, replaced by a cold rage and deep sadness. Her son had abandoned her to a slow death, and now the irony was that the life she was trying to preserve was being denied by other humans, who would not only ignore her, but who posed a mortal threat to her only guardian. The tiger let out a low growl, almost inaudible, but laden with contained fury. Its sapphire eyes fixed on the men, on the sounds, on the destruction. It felt the invasion, the desecration of its home. The elderly woman, crouching beside it, felt a deep connection to the animal's pain. She didn't want to be rescued by those men. She didn't want to return to the world that had spawned her son and that now destroyed everything pure. One of the men, separated from the group, lit a cigarette, looking distractedly at the forest edge. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, widened. He saw the white and black patch, the crouching figure beside her. A sharp cry tore through the air. "Tiger! An albino tiger and an old woman!" Panic spread. The chainsaw's engines fell silent. Voices turned into cries of alarm. Rifles were raised, pointed in their direction. The elderly woman felt her heart freeze. It was the end. She was exposed, vulnerable, and her guardian, a magnificent creature, would be shot down by those men. But the tiger did not hesitate. With a roar that made the earth tremble, a primal sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the forest, it launched itself, not towards the elderly woman, but to the side, in an explosion of speed and fury, straight into the center of the clearing, away from where she was. It was a diversionary maneuver, a calculated sacrifice. The men, caught by surprise by the ferocity and unexpected direction of the attack, screamed. Shots echoed, deafening as the tiger, a white and black blur, ran among the machines, drawing all attention and fire to itself. The elderly woman, paralyzed for an instant, saw the opportunity. The tiger was creating a curtain of chaos, a chance for her. She didn't think of her son, nor of lost luxury. She thought of the warmth of the tiger's body, the vigilance of its sapphire eyes, the lesson of compassion it had given her. She couldn't betray it. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she turned and ran. Not towards the clearing, not towards the men, but into the forest, into the protective darkness of the untouched trees. The sounds of pursuit and gunshots faded behind her, swallowed by the dense vegetation. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs threatened to give out. She fell, exhausted but not defeated. The silence of the forest embraced her again, a balm for her soul. She was alone, but she was not the same woman her son had abandoned. The jungle had transformed her, stripped her of her illusions, taught her the true nature of survival and loyalty. She had found a guardian where she least expected it. And it, with its final act, had freed her. The tiger's fate was uncertain, but its essence remained within her. She rose, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The journey was far from over, but now she wasn't seeking rescue. She was seeking a path, a place where she could live in peace with the memory of her albino protector. She was the jungle now, and the jungle would protect her. One step at a time, in the darkness, towards a dawn she would build for herself. Her son had tried to kill her, but the tiger had made her reborn, and that was the only truth that mattered.